On the afternoon of December 26th, a tank unit of Patton's 4th Armored Division breaks through to Bastogne. The next day, the corridor is widened. The siege is over, but not the fighting. December 28th, a driving snowstorm grounds all planes. The Wehrmacht advances on Bastogne with 9 divisions, 4 of them armored. A great part of this effort is aimed at closing the American corridor to the south. The Americans hold on and even widen their lifeline. On January 3rd, the Allies launch a 3-pronged counterattack. The Third Army continues its northward drive. The First Army continues south, and the British 30th Corps pushes in from the west. By January 16th, patrols from the 1st and 3rd Armies meet north of Bastogne. By early February, the Germans have been pushed back to where they started.
The Battle of the Bulge destroyed the last major offensive forces that Germany had. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, they knew they couldn't win. And from that time on, there was nobody left to fight on the Western Front. The remains of the Panzer Lehr Division was sent to the Eastern Front, where it was eventually destroyed. And with the losses in manpower, 250,000 men, it became clear that the German army no longer could fight on the Western Front.
Our tanks were going forward. We saw German tanks going the direction that we just came from, flying, and, you know, it was a bedlam. I particularly remember one tank waving to us happily, and then they realized we were Americans, and they all jumped out of the tank and got into the roadways.
Jules Berlinski would return to the United States after the war and work for a major department store in Los Angeles. It is a remarkable feat in itself for Patton's Third Army, poised to strike eastward, to turn north and race 125 miles to Bastogne in just 2 days. But more importantly, Patton's unit arrived prepared to fight immediately. Working to the American advantage is Adolf Hitler, who tells his officers that the operation is irrevocable. Through his absolute commitment to the plan, the Germans initially catch the Allies by surprise. For a brief moment, it gives them hope of a renewed victory. But in the end, the Battle of the Ardennes Forest becomes another in a long series of German defeats and the last offensive of World War II. After 4 years of fighting the Japanese, Americans realized that the only way to get the enemy to submit would be by bombing their homeland. Since there is no base close enough to Japan, B-29 bombers, the latest in the arsenal of aerial weaponry, fly from Chengdu, China. It's a long and arduous flight. But the B-29 is the key to American air strategy. These revolutionary, heavily armed bombers, the largest produced in the war, are capable of flying at altitudes of 38,000 feet and are able to carry payloads up to 15,000 pounds. Finally, the Americans get a foothold in the Mariana Islands in 1944 and build air bases for long-range bombers. It's only 1,500 miles to Japan. It isn't a moment too soon for Charles Phillips, who pilots a B-29.
The Chinese operation was a nightmare of logistics. Everything that was used by the B-29 from those remote bases near Chengdu, China, had to be airlifted over the Himalaya Mountains, the tallest mountains in the world. So as soon as an airfield could be prepared on the island of Tinian, General LeMay ordered them to relocate from where they were and come on over to Tinian.
On November 24th, the first wave of superfortresses takes off for Japan in a series of raids designed to bring the Japanese people to their knees. Meanwhile, back in the United States, more and more men are being rushed through training. Most of the men are impressed with the new bomber, but it's still highly classified, and they are restricted by tight security. For the pilots, though, the plane's enormous size presents its own problems.
The B-29 would weigh 70 tons, 140,000 pounds, and you always hoped that every one of the engines would perform well. because the takeoff was the most critical part of the entire mission.
Trainees are briefed in all aspects of flying the new B-29s, but until they're in battle, it's all theoretical. New planes are fitted and readied for flying to bases in Guam and the Marianas. Since the Japanese have lost so many planes in other battles, fighter pilots are reassigned to ground crews and anti-aircraft batteries.
Japanese air and naval forces were depleted, both through combat losses and training accidents. The Japanese, by this time, were trying to withhold some of their best pilots for forthcoming battles. So many of the pilots were young, new recruits. The problem that the Japanese had with air defense over the homeland is that they simply had no integrated system to defend the skies over Japan. As far as their Air Force, there were only 2 night fighter units, that is about 40 aircraft total, available for the defense of all of Tokyo.
As soon as B-29s are spotted, the gunners go into action, but the bombers are too high for their shells.
The early missions were made in formation. They were all made in daylight. They would have to form up in formation. They would have to climb to above 30,000 feet and then work their way into the target. There were these great high-altitude winds blowing. So the result was that they didn't hit a whole lot of targets real accurately.
The B-29 was a formidable weapon, certainly against the average Japanese plane. I mean, they would find themselves outgunned and dwarfed by this behemoth.
In daylight, it was a typical formation. Would be 9 aircraft with a leader and a deputy leader, and there were 3 groups of 3. The closer that they could fly together, the better they could defend themselves from fighter attacks. In the high-altitude attacks against Japan, the Japanese fighters had a terrible time because they couldn't keep up. They had to loiter out ahead of the formation and then make passes that would take them into the next formation and on and on. They could not make a tail chase and hope to catch up with us. B-29 was just too fast for them.
By the beginning of 1945, the B-29 raids are more accurate and are having a major effect on Japanese war production, adding to the threat of approaching American forces and the loss of important foreign bases. As the B-29 raids intensify, Japan's defense measures become desperate. Over 8 million children and non-essential urban dwellers are evacuated to the country. Those who remain are mobilized into civilian defense brigades. Slogans such as 100 million, one mind are commonplace. But the average Japanese, faced with destruction at home and defeat abroad, have begun to lose trust in the military leaders. Only for the emperor do they reserve their wholehearted respect and devotion. He embodies the Yamato spirit, for which the Japanese will make any sacrifice, including life itself.
The Japanese have an expression, shikata ganai, which means it's inevitable. It cannot be helped. By early 1945, many of the Japanese probably did look on the war as something that was shikata ganai. It was something that was happening to them and around them, but something that they were powerless to do anything about. The Japanese had seen the war take a steady toll on their quality of food, quality of clothing, and they had also seen their health care deteriorate. In other words, all of the things that people work for had steadily deteriorated throughout the course of the war.
In spite of inadequate planes and inferior guns, Japanese defenses are effective. After 22 raids, only 5% of damage is done to industrial targets. The headwinds over the mainland of Japan have made precision bombing difficult from high altitudes. And aside from the Japanese fighters, there are other risks for the bombers. In between missions, the pilot's life on the airbase of Tinian is relatively relaxed. The men can enjoy a taste of good old American baseball or participate in other sports. However, there's always the reminder that there are still Japanese in the jungle who will attack the airbase at any opportunity. To hit Japan more effectively, there's a change in tactic for the March 9th mission. From now on, B-29s will fly between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, carrying a new kind of bomb.
Well, General LeMay came up with a brand new notion that we would bomb individually at night and that we would deliver incendiary loads. I myself was directed to bomb at 7,800 feet on that first Tokyo mission. Others were bombing at lesser altitudes than that. On that first mission, there were 300 B-29s, which took off from Guam and Tinian and Saipan. We took off on the 9th, we bombed on the 10th. We wiped out 17 square miles of Tokyo in what was one of the worst fires in the history of man. We saw pieces of houses like windows and doors actually going by the airplane at around 8,000 feet. I've never been in worse turbulence in an aircraft anywhere that was stronger than that night, March 10th, over Tokyo. We had at least one airplane, which I'm sure was lost because of the pilot's effort to maintain his altitude in the face of a terrible turbulence. And the wings did pull off. The aircraft was seen in 3 major parts as it went down over the target that night.
In one night, 15 square miles are reduced to ashes. 84,000 people lose their lives, and 1 million are made homeless. March 1945. The B-29 air war against Japan continues now unrestricted, with raids on Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and other cities.
The Japanese reacted to the bombings by depopulating their major cities. After the May raid on Tokyo, the Japanese air forces, both Navy and Army, withdrew their fighters from air defense and began to hoard them in anticipation of the coming battle of the Japanese mainland. In other words, the military authorities wrote off the cities.
To accommodate the heavy load of bombs on the new low-altitude runs, some of the plane's weight must go. B-29 pilots cope with a trade-off, which makes each mission more dangerous.
Well, General LeMay had ordered that all but the tail gunner remain home, and of course, we thought that that was going to do us in too, that surely without any guns on the airplane except in the tail and no gunners, that we would probably just be in terrible trouble. It was going to be a huge suicidal mission. General LeMay had figured out that the automatic weapons, such as machine guns, would not get to our height, and that the fuses for the anti-aircraft couldn't be cut that low. And as a result, we didn't get touched by any kind of fire. General May's objective was have the bomb bays as full of bombs as you could get. And on those 5 missions in 10 days that we flew, each bomb bay was as full as you could get it. What he cut down on was the fuel load. Now, that was also an alarming situation because some of the fellows were just certain they would not have enough fuel to get back home again. But without having to climb at the high altitude, and being able to cruise at a much lower altitude, we didn't require nearly so much fuel. And he had that figured out well, too.
On May 23rd, a final knockout blow is directed against Tokyo. Meanwhile, American leaders make plans to bring the war to an end. Operation Olympic, scheduled for the fall, will be the first invasion force to enter Japan.
The incendiary bomb was the M69. This was dropped from the bomb bay in such a way that at about 1,000 feet or so, bands holding the bomb together would release, and then it would turn into what we called 38 bomblets that were filled with napalm, and whatever they hit, they ignited. It was on the bombing run. We would probably anticipate some flak, and the thing would just burst. The shell would turn into real sharp fragments that were very damaging. And the problem for the aircrew was that the aircraft might get hit in a vital spot. You could not help but sympathize with the people on the ground. There were thoughts about the folks on the ground and what they had to be suffering.
With more than 1/3 of the city laid waste, Tokyo was taken off the list of incendiary targets. American aircraft can now penetrate Japanese defenses with impunity.
The government issued emergency food rations to the survivors. They also organized special refugee trains to get more people out of the city. The magnitude of the American B-29 raids was overwhelming. Almost 100,000 people perished in a single night. Most of them were burned beyond recognition.
Japan's air losses have reached catastrophic proportions. Nearly 2,000 planes a month. The civilian population, underfed, fatigued, and discouraged, are at the end of their endurance. In a last valiant effort, hundreds of Japanese planes are specially fitted for kamikaze attacks. If B-29s cannot be shot down, they'll be brought down by mid-air rammings.
The kamikaze were mostly young, 19, 20 years old. They were chosen because of their aptitude for flying. Most of them tended to be bright young men. Their attitudes towards their missions varied tremendously. Some believed that by destroying a B-29, by ramming it, or by destroying an American warship off Okinawa, their death was meaningful because it delayed the American invasion of Japan for a single day. Others simply regarded the whole exercise as futile, as hopeless, and as meaningless. Yet they obeyed their orders. Very few refused to fly, even the ones who thought that this was the height of absurdity. They went to their deaths because they had been trained to do this, because their educational system had promoted the notion that to die for the emperor was the greatest duty of any loyal subject.
As Japanese kamikazes sacrifice their lives over their homeland, events have begun which will determine the outcome of the war. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 takes off. Its mission is to prevent an invasion of Japan. matter of seconds, over 70,000 lives are snuffed out. Another 70,000 are gravely injured. The atom bomb explosion has destroyed nearly 5 square miles of Hiroshima. Before Japan has time to recover, an atom bomb is dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. On August 14th, the Japanese government decides to accept the Allied terms of unconditional surrender. Atomic warfare has made further resistance futile. American B-29 pilots on Tinian are happy the war is over, but are not fully aware of what has happened to Japan. The realization of nuclear warfare will raise controversy about American tactics, but most servicemen agree that the atomic bombs saved thousands of lives on both sides by preventing an invasion of Japan. Officially, the war with Japan comes to an end at 10:30 a.m. September 2nd, 1945. Japanese diplomats assemble on the USS Missouri to sign the peace treaty on September 4th. General Douglas MacArthur presides over the signing.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
After the peace treaty is signed, American forces occupy all of Japan.
The Japanese never understood that the United States was deadly serious about unconditional surrender and would enforce it no matter what the cost.
For the millions of Japanese who now have to live with defeat, life will not be easy. But there is a proverb that says, after the rain, the ground becomes firmer. This saying would give some solace to a defeated country. B-29 pilot Charles Phillips would stay in the Air Force and fly modern bombers. Others who serve in the B-29 squadrons would return home with unforgettable images of battle. American air power plays a decisive role in achieving the final victory in World War II. The ruined cities of Japan are grim witness to the effect of thousands of planes carrying hundreds of thousands of bombs. Yet it is 2 planes carrying 2 bombs that would change the future of warfare forever and the course of human history. Chester Nimitz said it best: uncommon valor was a common virtue.
D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. The invasion of Fortress Europe was one of the greatest military adventures of all time. But from the outcome of this bold adventure hung the fate of war and freedom. It was because so much of man's hope had been bound up in the success of this adventure that the architect of that success found the hearts of the people open to him. In the dark spring of 1940, German armored divisions were crashing through Holland and Belgium. The Luftwaffe was streaking its destruction through Europe's skies. France was prostrate, and beleaguered Britain was standing alone. The United States had passed the Selective Service Act to prepare for what inevitably lay ahead. And the biggest challenge in Colonel Eisenhower's life was to aid in that preparation. Late in 1940, he was made Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division, where his staff work brought him assignment as Chief of Staff of the 9th Corps. In the summer of 1941, Colonel Eisenhower became Chief of Staff to General Walter Kruger, whose newly organized Third Army was preparing to participate in the most realistic war maneuvers yet held. Eisenhower was promoted to Brigadier General, and within a matter of days came the bombing of Pearl Harbor. From almost this moment on, the fate of the nation and the fate of General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be bound together. Called to Washington in the first weeks after the war began, Eisenhower went to work in the War Plans Office of the War Department. Among the plans formulated during this time was the strategic decision to make an eventual attack across the English Channel, the principal Allied offensive effort. The Supreme Commander's orders from the combined Chiefs of Staff were quite simple: to land on the coast of France, and thereafter to destroy the German ground forces. But it would take a great deal of effort to execute these orders. Across the Channel, the heavy fortifications lining the coast of France bespoke the Nazis' belief that they could push the invading armies back into the sea. In France alone, 58 German divisions were waiting. Preparing for the invasion was a job that required great effort. Incessant and realistic training was of paramount importance. The challenges of morale, the myriad details of coordination on every level, all these were overwhelming. Less than 2 months after the invasion, the Allied force broke out of the beachhead perimeter in the hedgerow country around Saint-Lô. Completion of the breakout was the next step, and then began the dramatic pursuit, spearheaded by General George S. Patton's armored force across the heart of France. And then the grand, triumphant march through Paris, which was freed by French troops and soldiers of the U.S. Fifth Corps. Beyond Paris lay the liberation of Belgium and the yard-by-yard struggle across the German border. Both commander and GI were able to find the exultation that comes when victory is close. Victory came, finally, with the German surrender in a schoolhouse at Reims on May the 7th, 1940.